I am for doing good to the poor, but I differ in opinion of the means. I think that the best way of doing good to the poor is not making them easy in poverty, but leading or driving them out of it. Thomas Jefferson. Capitalism has become a bit of a hot topic in recent years. There have been cries for change as many people in the West begin to see capitalism as an evil, oppressive force that must be put to an end. In fact, according to a Pew Research study, 39% of Americans have negative views of capitalism. For an economic system that builds up their very right to express such opinions, it's awfully curious how vehemently so many people hate it. Let's take a look back at how capitalism began, dominated the competition, and is now being shunned back as socially unacceptable. Capitalism came into being because of a mix of different ideas in the right time and the right place. Feudalism was the dominant system in Europe for centuries. People would be born, live, and die in utter poverty, and there was nothing to do about it. This all changed when trade began to pick up in Europe. As the country's nobility began to acquire more and more wealth, they started to yearn for more luxurious items that they couldn't have access to easily, such as spices. These items required trading to acquire, and boats would sail for weeks at a time to bring these items back for large monetary rewards. Though, since this job wasn't a job nobles wanted to do, and it also paid well, it gave an opportunity for many low-class farmers to have a job and rise out of the bottom class into a middle class. This created an unprecedented change where there was a new class of people who would be willing to pay money for goods and services that would be previously only for the rich. This cycle repeated far enough, but likely wouldn't be considered capitalism yet because of the nobility part that was still there. Eventually, when settlers came to the New World, that system without the nobility took over and became quite similar to what we think of today as capitalism. From here, we can see America arise as one of the first countries to be built entirely on capitalism. This system provided for people the ability to rise out of poverty if they worked hard enough. The idea of being able to do such a thing was unprecedented, and yet a commonality in all capitalism. This factor was one of the many that helped lead to America's power, and yet capitalism is still widely hated. Why would such a system that has provided so much for people be so widely hated? There are three big reasons people state as to why they have a hatred for capitalism. These explanations people give as to why they hate capitalism is that capitalism puts a disproportionate amount of power into a minority of people, capitalism cares more about economic profit than social good, and that capitalism is all about inequality. These are all explanations people will give if asked about why capitalism is so bad or why they hate it. Going through these, let's start with capitalism putting too much power into the hands of the few. While this does seem true at first, you have to realize that this isn't a rigid elite class. People are frequently seen moving between class levels and rising into a position of power. Almost all celebrities did not start wealthy and were self-made. Coincidentally, though, these very same people who went rags to riches complain about the system that facilitated that for them. Also, the power outside of the wealthy is relatively democratic, since the market usually follows where the majority of people are going to anyway. And second, capitalism cares more about economic profit than the good. This one point, I would argue, isn't a bug, but rather a feature. Because capitalism encourages things to be done that are profitable, it causes the most important issues to be solved in the most cost-efficient ways. If all you had was a group of scientists figuring out a problem with an unlimited budget, sure, they would figure out the solution. But the solution determined would be considerably less valuable because of how expensive it would be to recreate, since they had no limitations when developing the solution in the first place. Lastly, there's a matter of capitalism being all about inequality. I think that the argument that capitalism is based around inequality is flimsy at best. Capitalism has inequality, but so does literally everything else in the world. Just because people don't all receive the same outcome from capitalism doesn't mean that the system is bad. It just means that the system values certain things. What capitalism values as its key to success is hard work, which is something you can actually change and improve upon. As well, if inequality in America was truly so bad, you would see all the members of these so-called oppressed groups as unable to rise up through economic hierarchies. Though, seeing that happen is actually extremely common. Even if you disagree with me on these points, the biggest reason why I think capitalism is crucial is because any other system has these problems significantly worse. Let's take a look at how socialism fares at these same criteria we put up for capitalism. Since, after all, it is the most commonly listed alternative to capitalism, and so surely that should be has an answer to all these problems, right? Well, let's find out. First up, does socialism put disproportionate amount of power into a minority of people? Absolutely. It's just way different than how you think of it for capitalism. Socialism puts disproportionate amount of people into the hands of the lazy. Should a couch lounging, Cheeto fingered man who hasn't worked a day in his life make the same as a hard working construction worker? This inherently gives the lazy person more wealth and power than they deserve. At least what capitalism has going for it is that hard work is incentivized and people who work hard benefit. Does socialism care more about economic profit than social good? It does not. But I think that that is to its own detriment and not to its benefit. Because all socialism cares about is social good, the system is not able to sustain itself. It is essentially destined to fail by its own very nature. This is just like the problem I was discussing earlier, that economic ventures for profit almost always are the best and the most effective way. Look at SpaceX, for example. For decades, going to space was a costly endeavor that cost millions of dollars. It was inherently something that could not work in the private sector, as it stood. Because of this, when SpaceX came on the scene, they had the goal of making space travel economical. Because of this, their rocket technology is the most reusable and the most efficient compared to any other method of spaceflight. Lastly, for socialism, there is the matter of whether or not it is all about inequality. Tracing this back to when I talked about this one under capitalism, I was talking about how inequality is everywhere. The thing is, though, inequality isn't always bad. You don't want your average psychopath to be allowed to operate on you in surgery because they aren't experienced enough. Neither would you want a child to have the same rights as an adult. All these instances of inequality are beneficial to people, but even still, socialism fails this criteria for another reason. Because it still values people who don't work as hard more than people who do work hard. Aside from that, let's take a look at how successful each of these systems have been, respectively. The most prominent example of socialism ever must have been the USSR. I think for most people, when you talk about socialism, this is the first that comes to mind. The USSR relied upon state-owned property and state-controlled means of production. This resulted in a failure as their economy couldn't stand up to the successes of their free market in the West. In fact, there isn't any example of large-scale socialism succeeding. Even in small communities, it has proven to be unsuccessful many times because of its lack of personal incentives. For example, the very first instances of European colony in the Americas, or in America, was Jamestown, and it was socialist. It depended upon people doing enough to keep the colony running, but in fact, this led to famine and almost destroyed the colony. The only reason Jamestown was able to succeed was the introduction of a policy where if you don't work, then you weren't fed. With these examples and all the other examples of socialism failing, people are keen to say that these reasons for the failures here isn't the fault of socialism, but rather the fault of a poor execution of socialism. Though there are rarely any actual concrete plans for how this next time will be better when it looks identical to how it was the last 30 times it was failed. Now, for the instance of how much practical success capitalism has had, look no further than the entirety of the modern West to see how successful it has been. Everything you take for granted now can be traced back to the capitalist economy, encouraging innovation and developing new technologies. And with all this, I think it's clear to say that no, capitalism isn't perfect, but it is the best of the work, so to speak. There are an abundance of good economic systems. In fact, I would argue there are no truly perfect ones. But the thing about capitalism is that it is the best option available. How naive are we that we think that we can't even remember the numerous past socialist countries that all failed? In this modern time, we often think much more of ourselves and look back upon our ancestors as idiots when maybe we're the ones trying to reinvent the wheel.